Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Michael Keller. I'm the University Librarian here at Stanford University, and I am delighted to welcome you to this wonderful panel presentation entitled In Conversation, the Mark Ruwedel Photography Archive at Stanford. Mark Ruwedel is one of the two founding, it has an archive which is given to us, which is one of the two founding archives of the library's photography initiative. The other archive that was given to us that joins Mark's is that of Arthur Tress. The term "in conversation" is one that's important in this setting, and I ask you to pay attention to it. The exhibition being installed in our galleries, entitled Between Artists, Books, Albums, and Portfolios from the Mark Ruwedel Photography Archive at Stanford, places Ruwedel's works in visual conversations with many pieces from our collections, including the Carlton Watkins Mammoth albumen plates, Andre Breton's Nadja, Ebra Ruscha's Some Los Angeles Apartments, and various facsimile maps from the David Rumsey Map Center. The early installments of Mark's archive, and he continues to be a very active working photographer, demonstrate the value of incorporating photographic archives with our existing collections. Whether picturing the tracings of the Great Lakes of the Pleistocene era, notably Lake Bonneville, the expansion and abandonment of railways, mines, and towns throughout the Western US and Canada, or America's fraught history of nuclear weapons production and testing, Ruwedel's photography references geological, historical, economic, political, and artistic issues. The work is especially noteworthy in its quiet insistence that dialogue around these issues continue. By focusing our attention on what is left behind, on the impermanent nature of our presumed successes, Ruwedel challenges the founding ambitions that such enterprises, as just mentioned, had. While the photographic series can be epic in scale, involving decades of research, photographic fieldwork, accumulation, and contemplation, the handmade books resulting might be produced in a weekend. They serve as excellent introductions, especially for students, to the broader themes and purposes of Ruwedel's photographic practice. Although often classified as a landscape photographer, such a representation is quite incomplete. Ruwedel has stated, "I am interested in revealing the narratives contained within the landscape, especially those places where the land itself reveals as being both an agent of change and as the field of human endeavor." In his book, Mark Ruwedel, published in 2015, Grant Arnold describes Ruwedel's work in this way. I'm now quoting. "Over the past 3 decades, Mark Ruwedel has examined the intersections of representation, cultural memory, and shifting perceptions of space. His work is an epic account of North American civilization, extending from topologies of urban architecture to large-scale projects such as the Ice Age and Westward, the Course of Empire. Ruwedel represents landscape as a site where radically different scales of time intertwine. Picturing the Earth as an enormous historical archive, he describes his work as, in his words, an inquiry into the histories, cultural and natural, of places that reveal the land as both a field of human endeavor and an agent of historical processes. Ruwedel spotlights traces of human activity, whether an ancient footpath in Death Valley or a rotting wooden trestle abandoned after the failure of the Vancouver, Victoria, and Eastern Railroad, in relation to the geographic and geological upheavals that have shaped the Earth's surface. Our own Professor Richard White has referred to Ruwedel as a historian's photographer. Referring to the 2 of Ruwedel's handmade photo books in the exhibition, Rice and Devil's Den, White continues, and I'm now quoting again, "These photographs seem closer to the biblical, from dust to dust, But that is not quite true either. His West has not yet returned to dust. The people who created it and whose past creations crumble never appeared directly in these photographs. He photographs their signs. They are the exploited and exploiters, but they press on. He examines what they leave in their wake, what is left behind as progress passes and transforms. This is a section of world where you can tell where you are by the detritus, and Ruwedel is, in this sense, a photographic cartographer. Ruwedel was an associate professor at Concordia University, Montreal, from 1984 to 2001, and has been a professor of art at California State University, Long Beach, since 2002. He is based in both California and coastal British Columbia. His work is held by the Canadian Centre for Architecture, Montreal, Metropolitan Museum of Art, New York, National Gallery of Art, Washington, National Gallery of Australia, Canberra, Stedelijk Museum, Amsterdam, Tate Modern, London, and many, many other collections around the world, including now at the Stanford Libraries. Also participating in this talk today are Ann Thomas, who is the chief curator of photographs emeritus at the National Gallery of Canada. She has organized numerous exhibitions and installations and is the author of several catalogs and publications, including The Intimate World of Joseph Sudek in 2016. She is the editor of Beauty of Another Order, Photography and Science, winner in 1997 of the Krasna-Krause Award, and The Extended Moment, 50 years of collecting photographs at the National Gallery of Canada with John McElhone, published in 2018, winning the second prize in the Alcuin Society. Richard White, who I just mentioned, is one of my great favorites, is an emeritus professor of American history here at Stanford. He is an historian of the United States, specializing in the American West, the history of capitalism, environmental history, history and memory, and Native American history. His work has won numerous academic prizes, and he has twice been a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. He has written several books, articles, and chapters, including The Republic for Which It Stands, The United States During Reconstruction, and The Gilded Age, 1865 to 1896, published in 2017, among many others. I'm delighted to welcome Richard White, Ann Thomas, and Peter Blank as the panelists of this discussion, honoring and trying to interpret in a way the work of Mark Ruwedel. And I now pass this presentation over to Peter Blank, my colleague.
Thank you, Mike, for those comments. Most appreciated. I think we may have a new photography curator in our midst. Thank you very much, Mike. And welcome to all of you to this In Conversation event, sponsored in part by the Stanford Libraries Photography Initiative, which was launched in the summer of 2018 with the express purpose of acquiring photographers' archives for Stanford Libraries and to more fully incorporate photographic materials into the teaching and research mission of the university. We are here to celebrate the arrival in continuing installments with the Mark Ruwedel Photography Archive at Stanford, and to celebrate the opening of the current exhibition here in Green Library between artist books, albums, and portfolios from the Mark Ruwedel Photography Archive at Stanford, which Mike referenced. First and foremost, we must thank Mark Ruwedel himself for entrusting us with his materials and his legacy. We are honored. Thank you, Mark, very much. The acquisition of the Ruwedel archive to date would not have been possible without the generous support of our primary donors, Peter Barber and Tim Duty. Thank you, Peter and Tim, so much. David Naus and Richard Morehouse also deserve a tip of the hat for guiding Mark and Peter and Tim to special collections at Stanford. Thank you, David, and thank you, Richard. And of course, special thanks to Anne and Richard for joining us today. After their comments, we'll have a panel discussion, and then that will be followed by a question and answer period. If you have a question that you'd like to ask, please go ahead and use the Q&A box within Zoom and write your question down, and we'll get to as many of those as we can. We start with this portrait of Mark and his companion Spencer, who is sadly no longer with us. And I start with this self-portrait because it demonstrates Mark in the field. Mark goes out on these long and extended photographic field trips. They may take several days in the American Desert West. And it can't help but remind me of the great Western Expeditionary Survey trips of the U.S. Geological Survey in the 19th century with photographers like Timothy O'Sullivan, a photographer that Mark has acknowledged as being an important reference point for him. The photographic practice of Mark's has a complex substructure. Involves considerable research before the field trips and also afterwards. While the work is beautiful as images, often in a sort of a desolate beauty, the complexity of the practice is not necessarily revealed by the photographs themselves, which are somewhat silent. And the markers that they reveal are subtle markers, traces of historic activity, geological activity on the Earth's surface. Here we see Mark at Wendover Air Force Base. Spencer is sitting on top of a dummy bomb casing for the Little Boy type of atomic bomb that was dropped on Hiroshima in 1945. Wendover was the site where these dummy bombs were drop tested. And what Mark does is Mark goes out to these sites to do his work. The range of Mark's practice is considerable. And this is a sort of a flow chart that he developed for the 2014 Scotiabank Award catalog published in 2015. There's an enlargement of it here in the exhibition. Of course, the original is now part of the archive. But I just want you to take a look at the range of projects and the subject matters that they encompass, starting with the nuclear work in the upper left-hand quadrant and the reference to the Hanford stretch of the Columbia River, where the plutonium reactors were established by the US government in the late 1944, 45, I think, for the development of plutonium for warheads. That led to the larger Italian Navigator project called the Italian Navigator, after the famous quote that was sent from the University of Chicago by Enrico Fermi's team, that they had produced and controlled the first nuclear chain reaction within a nuclear reactor. And the code phrase was, the Italian Navigator has landed in the New World, and that's what Mark names that project after. The Ice Age project, the Westward, the Course of Empire material, which deals with the expansion and then abandonment of the Western railway system, and the leavings of railroad cuts, abandoned sidings, roadbeds, and so on. But I also want you to notice in the lower right-hand corner where it says handmade bookworks, where it points up to all of the projects. And the great thing about the handmade bookworks is that they provide a sort of excellent entrees into Mark's larger, epic, and more complex projects. The photographs themselves, as I mentioned, are quiet, and I'm going to use this term unassuming. When I think of Mark as a landscape photographer, I think of landscape with a lowercase l. I think of landscape as evidence. Mark's also been referred, so I think of Mark as like an evidentiary photographer in a sense. This is a diptych from the photographs along the Bozeman Trail portfolio from 1988, which was an early and foundational project for Mark, incorporating maps and penciled in captions. And I think one thing we might want to get back into is the sort of the volume of information that's in Mark's photographs compared to these the sort of absence, one might say, of volume as they in terms of like sound almost, and what they actually revealed to us. And so one question I will have for Mark is like, how do we get into this work? This is another one of those types of photographs. It's called View of Frenchman Flat from 1995-96. The question might be is, how would you know what's going on here? And I just want to point to, and this, I'm going to do something that I always think I cringe when I see people do this in Zoom talks, is I'm going to hold up a book. And I'm going to do that for two reasons. One, I want you to see this is the same image, but also to see it within the context of this catalog, the Italian Navigator, which, although commercially published, is one of the books Mark considers to be an artist book. And I don't want us to forget that what we're, even though in PowerPoint and in these Zoom talks, we must never forget that what we're dealing with are artifacts. Art is messy, interpreting art is messy. It's an archaeological process. But part of this captioning that grew out of the Bozeman portfolio continues here, and I'm just going to read some of the captions to give you an idea of the depth of the research that we're engaging with here. Nuya Segovia, that's N-E-W-E-S-O-G-O-B-I-A, Western Shoshone land. That's the name that the Western Shoshone gives to their lands. The Treaty of Ruby Valley, 1863. So now we have a renaming by American settlers. And this was a treaty that gave settlers access to this area for the purposes of mining and expansion. The witnesses, the Nevada test site, 925 of the United States, 1,051 announced nuclear test. Then a quote, a good place to throw used razor blades, Gordon Dean, Atomic Energy Commission. Underneath the photograph itself is a repeat of Nevada test site. Viewing area for 14 atmospheric test at Frenchman Flat, 1951 to 1962. So that's the range of information that we cannot necessarily see in this photograph, but which exists there for Mark, which he's unearthed as part of his historical research. One of the things that we've done in the exhibition is we've taken two of Mark's books, one, The Hanford Stretch, and we've blown them up and explored Mark's strategies in relaying this information. And then, of course, the Italian Navigator catalog I just showed you is right next to it. And these are cases 2 and 3 in the exhibition. And it gives you a way, as you're introduced to Mark's work, the beginnings of an understanding of the rigorous nature of Mark's practice, as well as the rigorous nature oftentimes of his presentations, much of which we'll get in today with our speakers. It's my pleasure to introduce you to Ann Thomas, who's the Senior Curator for Photographs Emeritus at the National Gallery of Canada. Ann, thank you so much for joining us.
Hi, thanks, Peter. Thank you for the invitation. And okay, start my video. Yep. Start your video. Okay. I would like to first of all congratulate Stanford University Libraries on this the acquisition of this remarkable archive. I think it's going to be highly useful and and greatly envied. The exhibition looks great too, Peter. Thank you for the invitation to be here. In the 10 minutes that I have at my disposal, and I did negotiate an extra 3 minutes, I'm going to look at how Mark's handmade books inform, enrich, and extend his practice. In 2014, after he received the Scotiabank Photography Award and also a Guggenheim grant in the same year, he was interviewed by Paul Roth, who is the director of the Ryerson Image Center, Ryerson University, Toronto, and Gaël Morel, who is the curator of exhibitions. And during the interview, they asked Mark about this, not departure exactly, but at what point and how did it come about that he started to make photo books? And in response to their asking this question, Mark had this to say. He said, I have long been interested in, quote unquote, artists' books. At some point in the 1990s, I began making small books as a way of exploring that form. Mind you, he said, I didn't want to learn about marble papers or how to sew leather. I was just interested in the idea of two-facing pages and sequencing images. Two pictures on the wall, he said, are somehow different from two pictures on a piece of paper with a fold in the middle. So my presentation is a response to that conundrum. In what ways are they somehow different? Even though Mark's pictures on the wall could generally be considered quiet, and this is interesting that all three of the speakers so far have used that adjective in relation to your work, Mark. Considered quiet by virtue of their deliberate compositions and subtle tonalities. They possess what I like to call wall power, and plenty of it. His superbly printed gelatin silver prints and less abundant, but equally finely crafted inkjet prints and chromogenic prints appear on the wall as single images, and we see one here, diptychs, in sequences, panoramas, or in grids. This single image here captures a sublime moment of light falling on the inner and upper face of Devil's Lookout Black Canyon of the Gunnison River, Colorado. And I believe if you look really closely, you'd be able to see Mark's van atop there somewhere. Next slide, please. Can I have the next slide? Yes, thank you. A more graphic image is this diptych of Cougar Mountain Cave, made in 1996. It relates to Ruwedel's epic Ice Age project, already alluded to, chronicling the evidence of human activity by way of footpaths, sleeping circles, among other ancient markings on the earth. Next slide. And this is one of Mark's signature grids. It depicts 9 bomb craters at Wendover, which Peter discussed earlier as the site of multiple atomic nuclear weapons test sites, and the site where the bombs, the A-bombs that were detonated over Nagasaki and Hiroshima were tested. And the grids can range from anything from 4 images to about 25 images. And Mark can correct me here. He loves correcting me. It's a favorite sport. So, but I think 25 is the max that I have counted. I like to think of Mark, and it's interesting, we've all kind of, I think, come to this conclusion that to call him just a landscape photographer does not do justice to what he does. I like to think of him more as a modern day explorer rather than a traditional landscape photographer. Part of his quest includes finding new forms that will give full and clear expression to his findings. This was made apparent very early on, and if I could have the next slide, made very apparent early on when Mark was a grad student in the MFA program at Concordia University in Montreal. And he submitted his final work, not as pictures on a wall, but in an alternative visual structure that we could describe loosely as a portfolio. It didn't have the traditional case, etc., but it was a grouping of images. There were 16 images, gels and silver prints, 8 of which were Mark's and made by Mark in 1981-82. The other 8 were made by Walker Evans. Well, not the prints, the negatives were made by him in 1935 when he made a relatively extensive documentation of Bethlehem. But the prints that are in the portfolio are Library of Congress prints made from Walker Evans negatives. There were 2 inspirational factors behind Mark making this portfolio. The one being that he was raised in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, and the other that one of the allures that got him away from painting and printmaking at Kutztown College was the work of Walker Evans. He was extremely attracted to it. I think the other thing that he says got him into photography was the music that they played in the dark rooms at the college. This project was done, I think, as a kind of, if we can go to the next slide, I will also just show you a map that is included in the portfolio. So included in this portfolio was a map, and what we see here are red dots that indicate where Walker Evans photographed, and red dots surrounded by a blue circle are where both Evans and Mark photographed. And but this was not what we would call a rephotography project by any means. The rephotography project is usually when a photographer goes 100 years or 50 years after a photographer has made views in a particular place and then rephotographs it. So this wasn't a, that's how it was then and this is how it is now kind of project. I think it was more a kind of fact-finding intelligence mission where Mark was exploring the extent of what we would call camera vision, or the way in which the camera would record what he was seeing. And he was also interested in getting to grips with the visual syntax of Walker Evans. And that, of course, would also impact on the way that he would think about his own literacy with the camera and his own visual composing of images. But in addition to being a really strong example of Mark's early art, this assembled group of prints and maps provides invaluable insight into Ruwedel's preoccupations and working methods and the direction his future work would take. Firstly, the inclusion of the map in the portfolio is evidence that the photographs were not considered as sacrosanct standalone objects, but rather a seminal element in the service of building a larger narrative. And I just want to say here, I love Michael Keller's description of him as a photographic cartographer. I think that's just perfect. Secondly, we see the early manifestations of mapping, tracking, recording, researching, and documenting of visual evidence of human passage across the surface of the Earth that are still the conceptual and visual elements of investigation that define and drive this artist's practice today. The handmade books vary in size, materials, and structure. Next slide, please. They range from rudimentary 2-page volumes with hardboards to more sophisticated multi-page books made from common stationery binders and enhanced with special papers and edge treatment. Regardless of the degree of finish, the books retain an attractive tactile quality. Titles are treated in a variety of ways. Sometimes they are hand lettered or digitally printed on the cover, or hand printed on labels such as very common red bordered jam jar labels. Those are my favorites. Generally, they examine an aspect of a larger theme, and that has been perfectly illustrated by that flow chart, which is incredible. A larger theme presented in the wall-hung works, or they focus on incidentally observed phenomena, like I think Mark was talking about, photographing some stones and then seeing them as being a kind of group that would lend themselves to a book. As a consequence, the number of images in the books is small, generally between 2 and 15. Here you see a typical American house, 2011. This is a simple construction using lighter weight paper, so it's the front cover and the rear cover, as titled. A simple construction using lighter weight paper on the inside signatures and a slightly heavier paper or a light card for the covers. It is composed of 4 gelatin silver prints and 9 digital prints. It includes found images from 1953, which Mark acquired from eBay. And what is depicted is the conducting of A-bomb tests on the Yucca Flats. Mark corrected me on the pronunciation of that, so thank you. As well as photographs made by Mark. What you see here is the verso, and this is a wonderful introduction into this book of the versos of these press prints, and that have, information about the dates and generally the kind of cut line information that the press corps would require. Next slide, please. Yeah, this is the title page, and next slide, please. So you can see how it's titled. And then this is a photograph made by Mark. And I'm assuming it's around 2011 when he made the book. It could be earlier. But this, what you see here, this is not the verso of Mark's image, but rather the verso of the previous image in the book. Next slide, please. In a conversation that Mark and I had, he addressed the fold in this way. The fold, that fold, he said, relates to the whole history of reading. Images are usually closer together than they would be on the wall. There is something about that crease that insists on a left to right reading. Given that Ruwedel explores the structure of the handmade book with the same doggedness as he does the histories and topologies of the land he photographs, the fold offered him an irresistible challenge. This is exemplified in this book, Nevada, Nevada. Here, Ruwedel subverts the usual structure and orientation of the book, left to right reading, by inverting the rear cover and inverting half the pages within, so the book has 2 front covers and can be read in either direction. The making of such a disorienting object that resembles a book, but where up is down and front and back are one and the same, is inspired by the ironies and contradictions inherent in the fact that Nevada is home to both the Department of Energy test sites and, ironically, Las Vegas gambling casinos, roughly an hour's drive apart. The process of making each book differs vastly. Sometimes it is created in response to a project whose final form is largely conceived as an exhibition. Next slide, please. At other times, Ruwedel actively sets about collecting images, his own or found images that he suspects to possess the makings of a book. The inspiration for a handmade book can also occur in the course of reviewing his earlier work. Then there is the serendipitous discarding of a print part of the aha moment. In the process of pitching a print from the Slab City series into the garbage, because it did not meet his exacting standards, Mark folded it in half and then saw, as it slid into the bin, its potential for the making of the book. So there are all kinds of ways that he has arrived at this, there's the conceptual kind of foreplay, if you like, that finally arrives at the results in the making of books like this. And this one is Slab City Rhino's Camp. So even as was said earlier, that these books can be made relatively easily and perhaps even quickly, they embody a lot of history and a lot of thinking and a lot of out of the box thinking. So regardless of how they come into being, the handmade books elude categorization, either as artists' books or photo books. The handmade books, whether held by the viewer or displayed in a vitrine, invite a more intimate, less public viewing experience. Turning the pages introduces new rhythms, more insistent connections between images, and from time to time discloses both the front and the back of a photograph. Ruwedell's handmade books are objects that extend and elaborate upon the pictorial narratives presented in his grids, his diptychs, triptychs, panoramas, but they also enjoy an independent existence. Deep dives into Ruwedell's subject matter, there are intrinsic meta-narratives. Thank you.
Thank you, Anne, so much for that wonderful overview of Mark's work. Really, really splendid. I should note that the National Gallery of Canada also has excellent holdings of Mark's work. And so Anne is quite familiar with them. Now very pleased to introduce Richard White, the Byrne Professor of American History Emeritus at Stanford University, who as a scholar of Western American studies has a wonderful perspective on Mark's work. Richard, welcome.
Thanks, Peter. Are you going to show the first slide of the Rice and Devil's Den? There. I'm going to talk about two of the photo books. My video is back, okay. Talk about two of Mark's photo books, which are Devil's Den in Kern County and Rice in San Bernardino County, which are two of the less traveled counties, but really quite important counties in California, one of them containing the Mojave Desert, the other one the southern part of the Central Valley. And there are also photographs which accent another side of Mark, that especially the Rice photograph, which I misread initially. The Rice photograph, I thought that was a bag of rice hanging off of a mesquite tree, but it turns out to be women's undergarments hanging off of a mesquite tree. And the whole beginning of Mark is that literally the sort of misreading, the startling, and realizing that somehow bras and panties had blown off of a truck and got snagged in trees, and that's the opening to Kern County. So my misreading is the kind of thing that Mark can do, which allows you to begin to look more deeply into what he's actually up to. And what he's up to is very conscious. I mean, can I have the next slide? This is the kind of photograph which people keep describing Mark as unassuming, and he is unassuming in a sense, in that this is an unassuming photograph, but it's actually a very, very deep photograph, because what Mark does purposefully is what I think all photographers do accidentally and don't even realize it. What Mark realizes is that all photographs are about temporality. They're never the picture of the moment that the now so often proverbial camera clicks. They all contain the past. They have to be photographs of the past, because virtually everything, not virtually, everything within the photograph exists before the photographer makes the picture. That everything in this photograph goes back to a deeper past. And Mark echoes this. I mean, what Mark does is do intentionally and elegantly what other people do accidentally and badly. That when you look at this, when you're familiar with the history of Western photography, you notice his car to the side of the road. You might not know it is his car, but it is his car. In the same way that in a lot of the landscape photographers of the 19th century, the survey photographers, you would see the wagon in which they hauled their equipment would occasionally come into the edge of the picture. The photographer never appears, but you know the photographer is there. The same way, when you look at the road is broken down. The road is the asphalt is decaying. It stretches off into the future, but it also brings up a past. When you look at that road, you know when that road was new, it was in much better condition. What you're looking at is something which once was pristine in the past, going on into a decayed present. And I could go on and on with any Marx photographs. The power poles, the utility poles along the road echo the kinds of ways that telegraph poles are a trope that recurs over and over again in the early photography of the 19th century. What Mark does in his photography is to fold the past into the present, to make you realize that even when you don't realize it, you are always seeing the past in the American West. It's right there in front of you, but this is the beauty of photography. You could go out there and not notice it. Mark makes you look. And Mark makes you look in a very sophisticated way, more sophisticated than you would look yourself. He both freezes it and guides your eyes. And he does it in an incredibly impressive way. Can I have the next photograph? Okay. One of the things I like about Mark's photography is his fascination with abandoned houses. You know, I share his affinity with abandoned houses. I mean, I grew up in LA and spent a lot of the time going out in the desert, which was once nearer LA, and many of the places that Mark went. And these abandoned houses are less prominent now, but they're clearly still there, but they once were everywhere. And what they've always reminded me of is when you look at those empty windows, those empty doors, they remind me of skulls. They remind me of this, that all of their windows and doors are just orifices, opening up into something which was once living and is dead, but not completely dead. One of the things it reminds you is that there was a life here, a life different than is here now, and its remnants are still there to educate you, to spark your curiosity, to make you wonder what had happened in this place before the moment you walked into it, before the moment that you yourself inhabit. And what Mark can do with this is something else, which I find absolutely fascinating, is his fixation on trees, which is both an artifact of what he photographs, but also, I think, something more than that. When you look at Mark's trees, these trees, it's not true in all of his, but in very many of his photographs, the trees are leafless. And it could be because it's winter, it could be because the trees are dead. But what the trees very often echo is that they were once living and they were doing something and still do something for that site. One of the ways you can mark, and I'll show this in a later photograph, a Western photograph and many of Mark's photographs is that where human beings first settled, where whites first settled, I shouldn't say human beings, where whites first settled are going to be marked by trees. They planted these trees for shade. They planted these trees for shelter. So if you want to look for an abandoned home site in the West, look for the trees. Look for the trees in the Central Valley. Look for the trees in the Mojave Desert. And what Mark does is pair the natural and the constructed, and they turn out to be both products of the same thing. It's not as if the trees existed and then they built a house there. Building the house brought the trees. The natural and the human-made, both of them come together. They're not easily separated in Mark's photographs because they're not easily separated in the American West. We can go to the next photograph too. And this is another sense of the same thing. I mean, palm trees are going to be something which, when you see them occur over much of the Mojave, it's not that there aren't some natural palms, but they're very rare. Most of the time, what you're going to see are palms that are going to be planted. And the original reason they're planted has disappeared, but they're still there. They become part, in a way, the living detritus, the abandoned stuff that's all over the American West. But when you compare things, it's quite elegantly. If you just look in the photograph on the right, what you have is this kind of detritus, the abandoned mattress, which are there, the tree, the bush behind it. And then behind that, even though Rice itself is a ghost town, it's not completely dead. It was once a railroad town, and the railroad still runs through it. Trains still pass. But what you have is this complex layering in Mark's pictures, which show you the natural, the human-made, the past, the present, and the ways in which it's impossible to disentwine them. And what he captures is, once you realize it's something very, very important, which very often you can miss entirely, unless, again, you have the photographer's eye to guide you. Can I go to the next one? Okay, and here again is the same thing. Here's the photograph, and you see what it's abandoned. It's by an old gas station. The gas station, the town, it's all gone, but the relics of this, begin to live on. And one of the things you get in these pictures, precisely because they're very often about ruins, they're often about things left behind, is that you're getting photographs which to me really capture something about the American West. They're not elegiac. They're not essays extolling progress, but what they really do is look at progress in a hard but sympathetic way. They're usually studies of decay and disintegration. But once you go out there and look, the elements of the picture lead you back to once were fuller elements of themselves, where you can imagine the time where cars were there to get gas in that gas station, where the shade provided for cars, which is now not shade at all, once sheltered human beings. You begin to get this sense of progress, which is one of the great themes of the West. And what progress usually is done these days is mocked. Because it's mocked because, in fact, we can see so much of the West, which is really a study in loss and degradation, particularly environmental degradation. And it can be easy to mock, but Mark never mocks it. His take is much more complicated. His photographs don't so much disavow progress. He admires the lives and the labor that went into these towns and homes and railroads, the things which are now abandoned, but he comes at it from a different angle. He's examining the wake of all this activity, all this labor, all of these human hopes that went into it. And he's not saying that they've been successful, but he's saying that they go on. Progress passes, the people themselves pass, but what he's photographing is the signs they left behind. He's photographing them not just as people who exploited the land, not just as exploiters, but people themselves who are going to be exploited. When I think of Mark's photographs here, I begin to think about it as a failed marriage. In the way you look back at a marriage, all the hope and the work that these once contained, and even though it ended very often in disaster, it's worthy of respect. Because even as its failures leave progeny as well as ruin. And I'll just mention, we'll come back to it more in the discussion, the last aspect of this in the last photograph, which you can see in this one too, is the way Mark treats the sky. I mean, if you looked at 19th century photographs, you realize there's really something very complicated and sophisticated going on here. This flat sky is a 19th century photographic sky. They did it because their technology was limited. Mark does it on purpose to echo those photographs. But at the same time, he can show an actual sky over here, which they had to do a great deal of work. They had to actually have to go back and touch up the photograph to bring it back in. But he can bring it back in a way here, and this will be the last thing I say about it because I'm going on too long. But in the classic kind of photograph with the oil wells, the power poles, the hills, which themselves eroded almost into nothingness, the openness of the whole landscape, all of this brings together this deep, deep temporality, which for me is always the mark of Mark's work. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Richard, for those comments. You can see why Richard is such a beloved professor by his students here at the university. Now it's my pleasure to introduce our photographer, Mark Ruwedel. Mark, of course, be very curious to hear your thoughts on what you've heard so far today, but I know you want to talk a little bit about the creation of your archive and the idea of having your archive here at Stanford. Welcome.
Thank you. I also wanted to point out that all three of the speakers, including myself, are somehow deemed emeritus, and I thought that was worth acknowledging. I have no idea why I said that. Yeah, I wanted to start just by saying something about the archive itself. Several years ago, my wife Corinne pointed to these massive steel shelving units, like completely jammed with boxes of photographs, and saying, if you get hit by a bus, I don't want to have to deal with this. So that started me on a kind of, an exploration of, in fact, what does happen to all this material. And, I won't go into the details of how, it finally came to Stanford, but what I like about the fact that it came I say it came in the past tense, it's an in progress kind of thing. I will work materials and other works will be going to Stanford for a long time to come. But what I liked about Stanford is that it's going to be a used archive. I'm afraid that lots of archives sort of, they sit in boxes and nobody sees them for decades and that. But according to Peter, the first deposits of my work at Stanford have already been used multiple times by students from various disciplines, which is really, really heartwarming, because the thing about one of the things I've been thinking about by photographs and photographs in general, in part because for many years I taught courses on the history of documentary photography, is that regardless of intention and whether or not one thinks they're making art or doing something else by making photographs, the photograph grows up to be a document of some sort. And so, I don't think that everything I've made could be considered, fine art or something like that. But all those other photographs that maybe got kicked out of the books that I made, or so on and so forth, in editing and that, they still contain or have the potential to contain historical information that could be of value to somebody in the future. So, so that's my take on that. Can I put up a slide? Yeah, okay. So this is kind of where I live now. And you can see, the reason I thought I'd show a couple pictures like this is to maybe underline a few things that came up rather obliquely in what Peter, Ann, and maybe Richard as well said, which was that this kind of idea of a working, I'm somebody who works with my material over and over and over again. Now, one example today, the book Typical American House that Anne spoke about, that photograph, you saw one of four of my photographs in that comprised that book. They were actually made in 1995, and as part of the Italian Navigator project. It's two different test houses at the Nevada test site that survived whatever size bomb was detonated in that locale. And I used those photographs or those images as wall-mounted pictures in exhibitions of my work about the history of the atomic bomb and the Cold War landscapes of the American West. But years later, with the magic of eBay, I started collecting historical material and one related to various interests of mine. And one of my small collections were these press prints of the Nevada test site, and in particular the test houses. And so I revisited that material and to kind of explore its potential in the form of the book as opposed to the wall. Let's have another slide. This is, yeah, I thought, if there's any young people watching, this is a darkroom. Okay, let's do the next one. Most of my work is made very traditionally, and this is what my studio started to look like once an agreement was made with Stanford. And what I did was I made a list of every project, large and small, that I'd been involved with since, including my thesis work in 1982, 83. And then try to make a determination on how to represent it in whole or in part. And this is me trying to figure that out. And people, when they visit the studio, if you look in the far left corner, there's one of those steel shelving units full of neatly stacked boxes with labels in that. So I've been very good at giving people the illusion that I'm organized. But in fact, one of the actually one of the pleasurable aspects of working on these archive project with Peter and Stanford Libraries is I've been finding things that I've completely forgotten about because I put them in the wrong box or something. I don't want to go on and on too much about this. I'd rather have a conversation with the other guests, but I made a few notes when Richard and Anne were speaking, and I'm just looking. Everybody seems to think that the pictures are quiet and that. And I just thought that was worth pointing out, that seems to be a commonly held assumption or interpretation. And I love the idea that Anne thinks I have this sport of correcting her, and I'm actually going to call her tomorrow and correct a few things she said. And I wanted to say something about what Richard said. You know, I read Richard's essay for the catalog of this exhibition, which hasn't been published yet, where he speaks about the tree as a kind of marker of for lack of a better word, of a marker of civilization, because most of the trees we see in the American West were in fact planted by settlers or later. And I've said in the past more than once, I think, that one of the things I liked about photographing in the West was that there's no trees, so you can see everything. But in fact, as Richard's pointed out, and I've been thinking about more and more, I've become a tree photographer. My current work is centered around the various types of landscapes of the Los Angeles basin, and one chapter of my current epic has to do with the Inland Empire, and I've noticed that a subject of that work has become these trees which were planted for, you know, shade, ornamentation, or so on, and they're often the last remnant of, say, an orchard or a ranch, which has more recently been, you know, replaced by a warehouse. So I'm gonna leave it at that and see if we can have some sort of talk. Okay, Peter.
Thank you, Mark.
Rescue me.
I should let folks know that the exhibition that's up in Green Library, for those of you in the Stanford community that have access to what we call the academic zone of Central Campus, I encourage you to come and see the show. Those of you who are outside, beyond the immediate Stanford family, all I can, in this age of pandemic, is ask you to regularly check the Stanford Library website to see what sort of access restrictions, if any, are still in place from Santa Clara County and Stanford University. You can always also just reach out to me directly, Peter Blank, B-L-A-N-K, here at Stanford, and I'll let you know what the status of access is. But the point I want to make is that the exhibition cases, the text for the cases, are actually a combination of some of my thoughts about Mark's work and how it's interacting with, for example, Surrealist material that might be in the same case. But there's also excerpts from an oral history that Mark and I have done on the handmade books, artist books, portfolios, and albums. So you're able to read and, in a sense, hear Mark's voice throughout the exhibition. And I'm very, very pleased with that. I also want to remind our viewers that if you have a question, to please use the question and answer box. And I see they're starting to pile up. We'll get to those eventually. My job now will be to get out of the way of the panelists and let a discussion begin. Mark, do you have anything that you want to continue with, Richard or Anne?
Yeah, there was a few things I was thinking about, and one is, just in response to what you just said. I think the work, for the most part, the work in this exhibition, even more than my own work, I think it's to really understand it, you'd have to see it. I mean, because I think the physical qualities of these objects are really part of how the object means what it means. And I think, Peter, you said something right at the beginning about, that early work in 1988, where I used the pencil captions and that, which of course don't appear on the PowerPoint very well. I've always, I mean, going back even before that time, I was really interested and still am in the idea that a photograph is both an image and an object. And I've always really stressed the kind of physical qualities of what I make. So I thought that was worth mentioning. I didn't put up this last slide when I gave my little 2 cents talk, but this is just another example of how and then this is also why it's been somewhat difficult to give things to Stanford, because I still use a lot of this stuff, you know, even though it is sitting in a box. So during the lockdown this past year, I made this 3 interlocking albums of this is taking off from the book that Anne showed, Nevada, Nevada. This is now called Nevada, Nevada, and Nevada. But the photographs in these book works, for the most part, were made in the 1990s, you know, but the book version is now dated 2020. So I wanted to say that. And but maybe a little, and one other thing, I don't know how important this is. I think I've really enjoyed hearing Richard's take on some of the work, because it's a new take for me. I haven't known him very long. And by contrast, I wanted to point out that I think the first time Anne saw my work I was still a grad student, so it was like 1980 or 81. So we have a really long history on that, and somehow we still are able to talk to each other. Yeah. Okay, so there you go. Just a few small observations.
Peter,
Yeah.
I have a question for Mark, actually.
Yeah.
I'd love you to address the surrealist books that you've made
Yeah.
recently.
Oh,
You know,
that's a whole other kettle of fish, isn't it? I grew up in a suburban home in a place that, you know, wasn't, let's say, culturally well endowed. And I always I grew up wanting to be an artist in a house that didn't have any art books or anything. And I'll try to make this short. I wanted to be a comic book artist. And that's why, in fact, I went to university to study art, because I felt like I needed to learn how to draw better to be a comic book artist. I was sort of a late young member of the counterculture. I was infatuated with Robert Crumb and the underground comics movement and all that stuff. But in searching for those kinds of books and so on in my local bookstores, I found the Dover edition of Max Ernst's collage novel, Un Semaine de Bonté. And that stayed with me, and you know, sort of popped up in my consciousness from time to time. And then several years ago, I saw this truly amazing exhibition of surrealism at the Vancouver Art Gallery, and it was one of those things where I thought, oh yeah, it's a summer show, there'll be a Magrittes and galleys, and I don't care about that stuff, and I'll just breeze through. But I ended up spending the whole day, because it was a really intelligent show that foregrounded the collages and the photographs and the film and all that other stuff. And the whole, I just got really, after that point, I really immersed myself in surrealism. And, you know, I reread Breton and Aragon, which I had read years ago. And so then, of course, at the same time, I started going to Paris every year for professional reasons. And I just decided to do something of putting those two things together. And I made a series of small books. And maybe in terms of what we're talking about overall today, this work is, the photographs I made for these surrealist books, if you want to call them that, were never intended to be wall art. I mean, I made all these pictures especially to try to make some of these books. And I really kind of pulled out the stops, like with this one, with the, you quoted me as saying I didn't want to have anything to do with marbled end papers. And 6 years later, here I am. You caught me with my pants down on that one. But I wanted to, in some way, not duplicate, but allude to the surrealist publications of the late 20s and early 30s in particular, in a way that maybe Richard and Peter pointed out, that some of my landscape photography alludes, without duplicating, alludes to 19th century photographs. So, or even like my first the first picture of the Walker Evans project was a kind of quotation. It was like in, in sort of bracketing a historical moment by my photograph and that. So that's sort of what those surrealist books are about in a way. And you know what, if I had my choice, I'd like to be a surrealist myself, but it's too late, I mean, they just seem to have a lot of fun.
It's interesting because after I discovered these books, which mainly were made in 2020, right?
Yeah, mostly well, let's say the last 2 years. Yeah.
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 And so I thought, gosh, never thought about Mark being a surrealist in any way in his work. And I, was struggling with that, kind of looking at it. And I guess that conceptually, maybe there is some of that.
Excuse me. I think, well, there's nobody's mentioned the title of this show, or tried to explain it, the idea of between. And that comes from a conversation I had with Peter, and maybe some earlier conversations with other people as well. Like, I don't recall, where I felt like, and this was an observation somebody else made of me. It wasn't my own thought, that my work was hard to categorize. It was so often in between lots of things that are easily categorizable. Okay. So this, yeah, so I mean, maybe the surrealist thing is really left field, but I'm also, I think having done these really large projects like Westward and Pictures of Hell and the Ice Age and the Desert Houses and that, I feel a lot freer now. I don't have to keep making the big statements. So I'm sort of, I feel a little more improvisatory, in what I'm doing. I mean, it's not like I'm not continuing that other work, but, and also I'm not teaching anymore. I get to do more work. I have more hours in the day to fill up. So this particular book, A Few Palm Trees, it's a 2-picture book, if you will. The photograph on the left it's a site that Ed Ruscha photographed, and I'm not going to remember the exact dates now, the late 60s, for his book, A Few Palm Trees. And of course, the palm trees got a lot higher, so I had to stand a lot further away than he would have to get the tops of them. And the other picture on the right are the 2 palm, one of those 2 palm trees is the one that John Baldessari stands in front of for his sort of iconic photo text piece called Wrong. And as it turns out, that house behind those 2 palms was Baldessari's studio at the time that his father owned. So I was sort of, I was really interested. I did a whole series of works photographs based on Baldessari's early photo text pieces, partly because they were all made in National City, where my parents lived during the Korean War. In fact, they lived 8 blocks from Baldessari, although, as one of my other handmade books says, they never met. Okay, so.
Mark and Richard, I love the idea of sitting down with all of you, but especially with you two, and listening to you talk about trees in the West. I suspect that my knowledge about trees and the West would be immeasurably increased. And Mark, you've mentioned that you've been thinking more about trees in your recent work, especially in the LA Basin area. Could you just extend that a little bit? And Richard, you are so familiar with Western iconography. Talk a little bit more about what trees meant to those who planted them.
I'll say one thing about what I was trying to bring up a few minutes ago, is like out in the Inland Empire in particular, like Loma Linda, Redlands, Highland, those communities, which was the so-called citrus belt at once upon a time. Often now, as you drive around, you'll see a field that's been completely flattened and plowed. It's just dirt. But standing in the middle of it are these two very old eucalyptus or some other related shade tree, and maybe an ornamental palm or two, and maybe the remains of a driveway. And you just know that not too long ago, that was a farmhouse surrounded by very healthy orange trees. So I'm thinking about that as kind of well, in a way, like, you know, I may maybe make a photograph that has, I don't know, just a piece of a detritus out in the desert. It's a little clue about a whole complex, a rich past life that, you know, there's just this one thing left that you could maybe extrapolate a whole history from, you know, or the photographs I made along the border where you see, like, you know, water bottles stashed under creosote bushes and that, you know, it's just this little piece of garbage. But what it signifies are these massive movements of people and geopolitical issues and all that. So I think that's the kind of, one of the constants I see in my work is a kind of, you know, trying to extrapolate something large by showing something small, if that makes sense, you know. And my wife makes fun of me because I never get the names of trees and plants right, so I can't go much further. I do know what a eucalyptus is, but beyond that, I mix them all up.
You know, it's a Stanford PhD, Jared Farmer, who now teaches at the University of Pennsylvania. And he wrote a wonderful book about California, and it's a history of California through 5 trees. And what he does is look at eucalyptus, palm trees, and orange trees, and he goes through and just gives the way in which all of these trees get introduced into a landscape. And in much the way Mark's talking about, you see the tree, you begin to see a story that goes around it. But it's also not just the planting of trees. You know, I grew up in Southern California, and I grew up in Southern California in Orange County when it was going from being orchards to being suburbs. So my initial memories of California are the bulldozing of avocado orchards, the bulldozing of orange orchards. But there's this moment in between, which is probably one of the reasons I have such affections for this, is I thought in California food was free. You know, that what you could do is you could roam the orchards and you could take whatever you wanted. Nobody cared. It was going to be plowed down soon. But I began to realize in between the planting of the trees and the destruction of the trees, much later, I didn't realize this when I was 9 or 10 years old, is essentially the history of Southern California. And if you look at trees closely, that's the kind of stuff you can see. And I think for, you know, again, what's always so remarkable about Mark's photography is that there's a sense in which he, as he just said, he just recognizes that. In the little things, they're just very, very big things. The big things are very often things historians are very interested in.
All right, thank you both. It's 3:42. We have more questions than we can possibly get to, pleased to say. But let's get started. Question for Mark, and this might be something, Anne, that you could weigh in on. Can you comment on how Ruwedell's work might relate to Carlton Watkins' photography, specifically of the railroads in the Sierras? And Mark, I don't know if you want to talk a little bit at all about the comment that you made to me about how both Watkins and somebody like Sullivan were important to you, and sometimes you thought of yourself as a Watkins guy and sometimes as more of an O'Sullivan guy.
Sort of as a kind of, I mean, as a lighthearted way of thinking about same versus different. I used to think of, I would posit that Watkins v. O'Sullivan would be like Johns versus Rauschenberg, or Louis Baltz and Robert Adams. It's sort of like, they're, in some ways they're very, very similar, but it's really instructive to kind of sort of dig at the differences, and it's a way of understanding what each of those people represent. And I saw them as kind of poles that I, at different points, would sort of move towards one or the other. And that one of the things that I think is really important to me in terms of what Watkins did, and in relationship to maybe what I think I'm doing, and what Richard thinks I'm doing, at least in some of this work, is that Watkins made these gorgeous celebratory photographs of farms or you know, sequoia trees and that. At the same time, he was photographing the destruction of the Sierra with the gold mining and the hydraulic mining and that. And I have no insight into how he's thinking about that, but I found that fascinating. Those simultaneously, or not simultaneously, but more or less at the same historical moment, making photographs that celebrated the beauty of the place and photographs that in some sense celebrated the destruction of that very beauty. So that's, in terms of I don't think of Watkins so much as a railroad photographer in the way that I would think of, say, Russell or Savage or some of these others, but I don't really want to, I'm not enough of a photographic historian to comment further on Watkins and the railroad. Okay.
There's a number of questions about the catalog. So what I can tell people is the catalog is in process. We hope to have it available before the exhibition closes. The exhibition runs to late September, and depending upon what's going on with pandemic related issues and so on, even though we were unfortunately not able to have an exhibition opening beyond this In Conversation event, it's quite possible that we may be able to have a closing event. So stay tuned to the exhibition website. And as I said, you can always contact me directly for information. Here's a question. I wonder if Mark could speak about his preference for grayscales rather than color. Is there a historical association? Does this support a general conceptual leaning? When color does enter, why does it?
The second part of that question is hard. But, well, the only grid we saw today was the 9 bomb craters. And so just take that as an example. Imagine how that would not work if there were 9 different blue skies in those pictures, because they wouldn't all be the same. I think in often cases, the color, in terms of my subject, color is extraneous and I think takes away, a lot of those pictures are really about the bones poking up through the surface of the skin of the earth. And I just think color would be really, really distracting. That's one thing. Another thing, of course, is the historical referent, but I don't think that's dominant, in the work. I think it's really about, the monochrome allows me to kind of foreground what I'm interested in and suppress things that I'm less interested, aspects of the scene that I'm less interested in. When I do make color pictures, to be honest, sometimes I don't trust them and trust the color, and I'll make both because with a view camera, one can do that and decide later. But there have been some series that have been exclusively in color. The Doghouse project, which is somewhat of a satellite project of a much larger thing about abandoned houses. The first Doghouse picture I made in color partly because of the time of day. I thought in that case the color would do exactly what I didn't want it to do in other pictures, which would be to kind of clarify the structure and its relationship to the land. And then I just decided to do those in color as a way of following through some sort of consistency within the group of pictures. It's pretty simple and not very sophisticated reason, but so I mean I've made color photographs since I started basically making photographs. It's just they're kind of maybe 5 to 8% of my total output in that, and I'm very suspicious of. I'll probably make more color pictures now than I did, partly because I'm starting to find my way around digital printing in color. I'm trying to, find my voice in that relatively new vocabulary, and maybe part of my aversion to a lot of color photographs has to do with the limitations of previous technologies. Okay. Some thoughts on color.
Yeah. Anne and Richard, I wonder if you might weigh in here. For example, Anne, you're very familiar with Mark's work. And I wonder if you think would it work in color? Richard, similar question for you. You've done such a wonderful close reading of Rice and Devil's Den. Could you see those as color books?
Do you want me to go first?
Yes, please, please.
So when Mark was talking about, I mean, I understand totally his explanation of the Wendover Air Force Base, the 9 bomb craters. I think where color is essential, such as in the Crossing series, the fact that you can see an abandoned passport. So the Crossing series, for those who perhaps don't know it, is where Mark he photographed evidence of people having crossed over from the border into the United States, not from Canada, but from Mexico. But some of them had like Guatemalan passports and so on, which they had abandoned, or baby carriers. And the poignancy of the items that they left, I think, is enhanced by the fact that they're in color. You know, there's something about that series that I think wouldn't work in black and white. That's my feeling about that. There's something descriptive about the color. It's not just color because it's chroma, it's color because it's descriptive. It's information that you need.
Yeah, if I'll jump in on that. I just a minute ago mentioned that sometimes I don't know if color is going to work, and I sort of hedge my bets. But those pictures that Anne's talking about, the Crossing series, I knew from the first one that they would have to be color, and it was just this kind of gut feeling about the kind of evidence and the way it sat on the desert pavement, you know. So.
I mean, I'm not sure what color would add to Devil's Den when you see the images up on the screen. And the other thing, it's you know, I don't know the time of day when Mark photographs this. I imagine, like most photographers, he's photographing in the morning and the evening. But one of the things that this does is my whole memory of being in the Central Valley, being in the Inland Empire, being in the Mojave Desert is the middle of the day. It's a middle of the day kind of place. And this is middle of the day light, and middle of the day light just bleaches out the color. And that's the kind of thing that it brings out here. You know, to piggyback on an earlier question, you know, I think if Carlton Watkins were photographing, he'd put everything in color. Because I think one of the things that Watkins did, his great advantage was being in the 19th century. His railroad pictures, the major thing Carlton Railroad's pictures is showing you could build a railroad there. It's flat. I mean, those are photographs taken for a purpose, to show you that, to promote railroads, promote steamboats. They're very much commercial photography. And so my guess is, you know, if 19th century had color, Watkins would have color, and it's a very different purpose than what Mark is doing.
But Slab City, I think, probably, you know, works better in color.
Yes, for sure.
It's the
But you know, that book, Slab City, is bracketed by 2 black and white pictures. so that center spread of the color has a kind of rhetorical function in terms of the book as a whole too. You know, I don't think you showed it, Peter, but the actual sort of graphic for the exhibition, which has that round photograph I made, it's called after Carlton Watkins.
Right.
I don't know if anybody can see that or not, but there's a, you know, that's a picture. Now, since we're talking about Watkins, it's a photograph of the General Sherman tree, and it's sort of made in the manner of some of Watkins's more pictorialist attempts, you know, around, or he made some oval pictures as well. But the reason I made that photograph was because of the turn of the century communists that had a colony there. And named that tree the Karl Marx tree. so that was, otherwise, I mean, I would have never made that picture if it wasn't for the commies in the woods, so to speak. You know, the second tallest tree, of course, was the Friedrich Engels tree.
I should let people know that in the exhibition proper, we have 2 cases. where there are some comparisons between our wonderful holdings of Carlton Watkins mammoth albumin plates and a small prototype portfolio that Mark did of views after Watkins views. And it makes for quite interesting viewing, I think. Here's a question. There's no way we can get to all your questions, folks. Thank you so much for participating. There's a lot of questions, a number of questions, Mark, about lenses and whatnot, which I don't think we'll get into. But here's one. I was interested in Mark's dialogue with Walker Evans, and I wonder how long that went on. In other words, is Evans still an intertext for Mark?
Okay, I'll go through that pretty quickly. I first saw an Evans photograph in an art history survey class when I was an undergraduate, and the instructor was just using it to illustrate the idea of company housing. He didn't identify the photograph as being a photograph by any particular person, but it caught my eye because it was actually a photograph of my girlfriend's house. And like 4 hours or so after that lecture, I was going to park in that photograph. That's how I thought of it. So that sort of started this thing. When I graduated with my BFA in painting, I went to the only bookstore in town, the little town where the school was, and bought myself 2 graduation presents. One was Emmett Gowan photographs, and the other was Walker Evans American photographs. So you can see that I was kind of going, but the Evans thing, and then so that sort of I didn't study photography. It wasn't I wasn't interested when I went to school, and there was just 2 classes. And if anybody wanted to know what that music in the darkroom was that Anne referred to, as Miles Davis. So Evans sort of popped up in the, in the foreground and background of my thinking as I was basically teaching myself photographic history before I went to grad school. And then when I was in Montreal, which is where I went to school, people say, "Where are you from?" And I'd say Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. And they say, "Oh, isn't that where Walker Evans did that, blah, blah, blah." And so I started thinking about I slowly sort of formed this project, and the MFA at Concordia was in 2 parts, and it was a traditional exhibition for a studio degree, but there was also a separate independent academic project requirement, and so I did that on the Evans thing, and I gradually sort of defined the project to be, I shouldn't say it that way. After I made the pictures, I realized what I was really doing was investigating how cameras work and the idea of syntax, and how those kinds of technical decisions and philosophical, all those things add up to the kind of potential meanings that a photograph can carry in that. So unlike traditional rephotography projects, I made each of those pictures a different degree of difference from the model of the Evans, quote, original, as a way to talk about, and I used them, they were basically made as illustrations for a lecture that I gave originally. Evans is still really fascinating to me. I mean, I just read a rather new book about Evans that you would think after all the stuff I've read on him, but there was a slightly different take on it, but it was by an art historian who is steeped in European painting and stuff. I also learned that Evans was fluent enough in French to translate some Surrealist poetry when he was there as a young man. So he keeps popping up, and if you want to wrestle with the really difficult questions about art and document that photography always raises, there's no better place than the work of Evans to kind of think about those kinds of questions. So that's speed reading answer to that.
Okay.
Really good question.
Here's I think we've got time for one more question, and this is a good one for all 3 of you. Mark is a practicing photographer whose archive is being placed at Stanford University. Richard White as a professor who regularly works with original materials in his research in the classroom. And Anne, who's so familiar with the photography community and the number of photographers out there. A question about archives. There are many photographers, whole generations of them, some famous, some less so, who have large archives that need protections. Museums usually only collect the few best works, but in this country, there seems to be a real lack of institutions acquiring and securing these materials. Any thoughts on this? And I think the unspoken part is, what can we do?
Well, that's a conversation you and I had a lot with people in Paris at Paris
Yeah.
Photo 2 years ago. I know Anne, the National Gallery has a few archives, but very, very selective. I think it's I'm not the professional in this field, so but we shouldn't forget that there is the center in Tucson, which was, you know, set up specifically to acquire and protect photographers' archives. And then there are places like the National Gallery or Yale University or and now Stanford, who are being, you know, who collect other kinds of archives as well. And if we really quickly circle back to something from the beginning of our event here, another reason that I'm really pleased to be housed, if you will, at Stanford is the quality of some of the non-photographic archives that you guys have. Like, I mean, the first time I visited the libraries, you said at the desk, like, you got anything interesting? And oh, there's this, and it's, you know, the original manuscript to Hal by Allen Ginsberg. I said, okay, you know, this is pretty cool. You know? So, but beyond that, I mean, I understand it as a problem, and I've had conversations recently with, you know, colleagues about, you know, what should they do with theirs, and, you know, and I don't know what to do. You know?
Yeah.
I just say briefly that for working historians, the value of the archive is we want everything.
Yeah.
We don't want the finished product. We want everything. We want everything that was thrown out, everything that was included, everything that led up to it. That's what's really valuable.
Yeah. And that's what makes archives so expensive to keep, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
But they're so critical. I mean, you know, I'm terrified that what's going to happen is everything's going to get digitized, and you're going to lose that sense of, you know, what the original notes and documents were about. But they are, I think the biggest problem is an economic problem with the funding of libraries and archives, and a general kind of dismissive disregard for what research and the importance of historic documents is. For art museums, Mark is quite right. The National Gallery does have strong archives of, but it's selective, and it's basically, you know, artists who are collected in depth. And I'm really sorry we don't have Mark's archive, by the way. But you know, we were also looking at archives in our, you know, in the National Gallery where I used to, you know, retired from there, but where you are collecting objects that artists made that are really important. You know, one of the artists worked with for years with a robotic engineer, and some of his most wonderful magical works are robotic, and we need to have those parts as well as, you know, letters, correspondence, photographs, everything else. So it's a space problem, you know, storage. It's having the bodies who can catalog and make and compose finding aids and make the work accessible. And so there's got to be a commitment at a really high level to fund and support that kind of activity.
I have one more thing popped up in my head about this. There is the Archives of American Art that the Smithsonian Institute run. And I have a colleague of mine is their West Coast rep. I'm not going to mention his name so that he gets 100 phone calls, but they are actively looking, he's actively looking in particular at West Coast artists and that, and trying to help place various archives. So the people are dealing with this issue, with this question, but certainly a lot more needs to be done. And
so much more does need to be done. And I think the university, specifically the libraries, have shown great foresight in launching the photography initiative. I think it's going to make Stanford Libraries, which are already a destination for researchers worldwide, an even more important and vital destination, and will provide undergraduates and graduate students of folks like Richard with incredibly rich resources to explore in the classroom and for papers and for dissertations. And we hope to lend colleagues such as Anne photographs for exhibitions that are monographic in nature, group in nature, or thematic in nature. I just want to remind people that the exhibition is up into late September. Please stay tuned to the Stanford Libraries website about regarding access issues. The catalog will be available. There may also be a closing event. So as is typical of the pandemic age, all I can tell you is stay tuned. Anne Thomas, Richard White, I cannot thank you enough for your time and support of this exhibition and your essays for the catalog. Mark Ruwedel, it's an honor to have your materials here at Stanford University. Those of you who did not have your questions answered, I apologize. The fact that there were so many, I think, demonstrates the interest in Mark's work and this panel today. Thank you so much for joining us. On behalf of the Stanford Libraries Photography Initiative, I thank you very much.
Thanks, Steve.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, bye.